Hey guys, what's up? It's Ripe again. In today's video, an entitled HOA neighbor Karen wants to call the cops on us on the first day of moving into our new house. Quick apology in advance, I am still a little bit sick, so my voice might sound weird. And now let's dive right into the stories. Hello all, my name is Jamal, and along with my wife, 15-year-old son and elderly father, we recently had to move due to structural damages on the old house. We were lucky to find a similar house in the same area, so that we did not need to go through the trouble of finding new jobs or a new school for Jason, our son though. None of us are strangers to hardship, but neither did we expect the hassle that would come from a certain someone. It turns out the neighborhood is managed by a local HOA, but our house somehow falls outside the range of their control. So while we do pay a small amount monthly for our share of the neighborhood upkeep, we are not subject to their rules or standards. It is an odd system, but it gives us a little more freedom than our neighbors, so I cannot complain. The first day we started moving our stuff into the house, we had our first encounter with a new neighbor, Karen, the president of the local HOA. The sun began to disappear over the horizon as we collapsed beside the pool in the yard to rest after a long day. The moving vans had left and it was just us and our boxes now. As we sat and chat under the porch light, we saw a figure hustling over to us under the torchlight. The woman began to question who we were, why we were here, what we wanted, etc. And we sat quiet in disbelief that someone, after watching us move furniture into the house all day, would suspect us of being intruders or burglars. And yeah guys, obviously Karen is not exactly the sharpest tool in this shed. Either way, I tried to explain the situation to her, but I could tell she was not buying it. Despite my best efforts, she even seemed to be getting angrier, as if it were a bad cop routine. Her last words before she turned to storm off were that this is no house for a black family to live. We heaved a collective sigh and retired for the evening. Over the course of the next week, as we are slowly beginning to settle down after the fiasco of a first impression Karen left, she emerged again from underneath her deep ignorance. This time she seemed to be going door to door posting catalogs, and I was unlucky enough to be mowing the grass out front when she came by. Rather than post it through our door, she stomped her way up to me and shoved the catalog into my hands, peering down from her tinted sunglasses disapprovingly, before continuing her path up the street. I flipped through what looked like a chunky update to the rules and regulations for residents of the local HOA. I threw it on the porch as I continued my work, not prepared to read through or memorize stuff that did not apply to us here. As we all were eating dinner, a few hours later into the afternoon, we heard a series of hard knocks against the front door, almost startling us like a rude awakening. There stood Karen holding a catalog in her hands, furious that we had left it outside to be destroyed by the rainfall. I stood in silent defiance across the doorway. Despite the rain, I was not about to let an unwelcome guest as rude as she was in to take shelter, so she could continue her angry ranting longer. She asked to be let in, and I tried to play it off, saying that we were currently busy and at dinner, not expecting guests, and Karen took this as a sign of hostility, which only threw her into another outburst about rules we had to follow if we wanted to keep living here. After she simmered down, I managed to give a brief reply. Our house is not managed by the HOA, so your rules don't apply here. For the first time since we have met her, Karen's face shifted from boiling rage to pale shock, and she stormed off without a retort. Was she embarrassed or perhaps shocked that she had no power over us? The next morning my wife goes to the mailbox and finds it hard to open the front door, but after some effort we find a pile of catalogs and leaflets left stacked against the door with no one else around. The stack contained HOA material with titles such as Benefits to Joining Your HOA and an HOA application form that looked handwritten, so the mystery was quickly solved as to who left them. Not wishing to indulge the crazy lady, we took them inside but did not read them. My wife then texted her back thanking her for the papers but told her again that we had no interest in joining their HOA, but she did not reply. After a week of peace and quiet, we began to receive fines in the mail from the HOA for minor grievances, and it looked like Karen had not gotten the message yet. We were worried if we could still be prosecuted, but our attorney assured us these were empty threats, so I ignored her. Our issues with Karen escalated when my son went out for groceries and had been stopped by police for an inspection after an anonymous tip that he was carrying drugs. I was furious at the blatant racism and disrespect, not to mention the embarrassment it caused my son in his own neighborhood. He said that he saw Karen standing at her window on a call, so suspected that she was probably behind it. I stormed over to Karen's house and ripped into her with insults and threats. As blind rage overcame me, I left when I was finished before letting her reply. She hurried back inside and slammed the door, seemingly in a state of shock or panic. After that, we thought we saw the last of her. My tirade had finally put a stop to her insistence and orders, and then we had one more surprise, one terrible, fateful night. It must have been very late evening or early morning when I was suddenly woken up to my wife shaking me and looking panicked. Smoke filled the corridor outside like a layer of thick fog and had begun to curl into the bedroom. After waking everyone up, we escaped downstairs and found a safe exit out of the building before I went back inside to call for help. Within minutes, a few neighbors had burst out of their homes in full kit. It turns out we had firefighters locally and they began to assess the situation. 10 minutes since we got out, we sat on the front yard as the fire sirens drew closer with flashing lights that woke and intrigued other neighbors who had come to investigate. The fire was quickly put out with little damage. The front door was charred black and there was smoke damage inside, but my family were okay, so that could all be dealt with later. Police arrived later to disperse the crowd back to their beds as we spoke to the firefighters. They identified the cause of the fire to be a stack of papers soaked in gasoline and propped up against the front door, prompting suspicion that requires police intervention. A week later, Karen was identified as the culprit after a number of reports against her from other neighbors came to light, as well as an eyewitness from a late jogger. The HOA president was replaced by a kind elderly man, and Karen was sentenced to 5 years behind bars. And yeah, Ripe Stars, that is certainly a very good ending for this story, and hopefully in the future this HOA becomes more peaceful. Because how do we say, like one rotten egg can spoil the full basket or something? This might have just been what happened here. Either way, let's continue with the next story. This one is titled Beautiful Petty Revenge. I've been enjoying the Schadenfreude here for a long time and I am pleased to finally have something worth sharing myself. My wife came to me with some unexpectedly happy news and I feel it meets the expectations of Petty Revenge readers. Some backstory: my mother-in-law has spent her life cultivating a career of emotional terrorism, visiting it upon her children and grandchildren with extreme prejudice, along with most anyone who gets close to any of those aforementioned. She is narcissistic, bipolar, and just a mess. My brother-in-law, wife, and kids all have some manner of trauma traceable to my mother-in-law's influence. My father-in-law, comparatively, has been a saint of a man from what I can tell, aside from losing marks by way of enabling his wife's behavior over the years. Father-in-law helped us purchase our home in the same neighborhood many years ago, when we had trouble with a loan, with plenty of passive aggression from mother-in-law on the matter in the background. It was bought outright with the equity of father-in-law/mother-in-law's home. We pay the mortgage towards their equity loan monthly. And by the way, Ripe Stars, I know maybe in this situation OP did not have any other choice, but if I had such a terrible mother-in-law, I would certainly not be in on some kind of deal like that. It would always feel like you are dependent on this woman. But anyway, this has also led to mother-in-law referring to us as her tenants, passing herself as the owner of the home, etc. in some really embarrassing ways. Father-in-law has passed away recently. Mother-in-law has a long history of making everything, from her son's coming out to her daughter's divorce, about her. This, as expected, has been an endless wealth of drama from my mother-in-law. My wife has been taking care of things around her home while she wails as the grieving widow. My wife recently discovered that most of the house bills were unpaid and that some were headed to collection soon. My wife gathered up the bills and made spreadsheets presenting them to my mother-in-law. Her first reaction was to wail incoherently. When my wife suggested ways to resolve the debt, my mother-in-law became hateful towards her. "You just want to get your hands on our money." Now, father-in-law did extremely well in planning his retirement. He managed a portfolio that left him and his wife close to $750,000, and they have enjoyed a modestly extravagant decade doing literally anything they pleased. Father-in-law managed all the finances, and so they fell into slight disrepair in his absence. Anytime it came up, cue the hysterics, hence my wife's offer. My wife, who has ever been the dutiful daughter despite the constant put-downs and harassment from her mother, suggested that she explore a power of attorney so that my wife could consolidate her finances, get a lawyer to manage the estate and see to any bills and arrange for a will if she so wished. After a week of silence, my wife received a rather vitriolic message from mother-in-law. "I'm doing the power of attorney, but I'm giving it to your brother." I neglected to mention that any prior whisper of a will was met with daggers from mother-in-law, and her favorite phrase on the matter was, "Don't even ask, you got yours." We are definitely not banking on getting a cent of inheritance, we made our peace with it, no problem. But it is salt in the wounds my mother-in-law has dealt my wife, brother-in-law and the kids over their respective lifetimes. Enter my brother-in-law. He was the firstborn and he has never put up with any of the crap my mother-in-law has tried to sling at him. He grew up shielding my wife from the bulk of her outbursts, at least partially, and calls mother-in-law out on her behavior. As a result, a neat little phenomenon occurred where as my wife seeks mother-in-law's approval and affection, my mother-in-law seeks the same from brother-in-law. Brother-in-law does not like the raw deal mother-in-law has been giving my wife. He takes the power of attorney and consolidates all the debts, sets up the estate, etc., and in doing so, he digs into all the accounts. It turns out father-in-law had set aside money for his kids and grandkids in addition to his retirement, to the tune of about $200K each. Mother-in-law seems to have had no intention of passing it along. Good thing is, brother-in-law is now the acting executor, and at first, guys, I read executioner thanks to the power of attorney. So after seeing the care of mother-in-law to the end of her days and the management of her estate unbeknownst to her, brother-in-law paid off the entirety of the outstanding equity on mother-in-law's home. This paid off our home and he released access to the trusts belonging to him and my wife and put the trust for our kids in my wife's name. We now have the potential to be completely debt-free before the end of the year. This is life-changing. My wife is over the moon and obviously so am I. It will be all the sweeter if my mother-in-law decides to crack at my wife with that "you got yours again." My wife can just smile and nod and know that it is really true. Well-deserved comeuppance for her and brother-in-law after what they've had to endure under mother-in-law all their lives. I hope you enjoyed. And yeah guys, I guess these years of emotional terrorism might have been worth it after all. Then again, it's really sad that people can be like this. But either way, let's continue to the next one. This one is another petty revenge story and it is an absolute banger. A few years ago, I was down on my luck and decided to work for a nationwide pizza chain. I had worked there at various locations and in every position, off and on since I was a teenager. At this point, I was 30, so I figured my 15 years of experience should count for something. After a few months of working, I asked how I could move up to manager. Seeing as how I was just, if not more, knowledgeable than the current managers, I thought I would be a shoo-in. I was told by the regional manager that once I got a vehicle of my own, he would promote me. I found a place that would take a small down payment and lease me a car with an outrageous interest rate. I was desperate to get on my feet, and as long as the job was legit, I would struggle all I had to in order to eventually make it up the ladder. I became a manager and immediately felt like a fool. Apparently managers only get a $1 raise and are now expected to put up with way more crap than that $1 afforded. We had to clean the entire store on closing shift, sometimes be there until 4 AM, etc. I was bamboozled, but it was fine. I was on a mission to escape the street life I grew up in, as I refused to ever sell drugs again. Anyway, about a year into my manager position comes our busiest day of the year. That's right, Super Bowl Sunday. All managers were scheduled to come in at 9 AM in order to prep. I arrived promptly and begging the prep tasks. Being on time is something I pride myself in, but I know my coworkers are often late, so I assumed they were just a few minutes behind. Unfortunately, the next manager did not come in until 10 AM and was clearly hungover to the point that he was no help at all. Each subsequent manager came in 1 hour after another until all 4 of us were finally there. At this point I was a little upset and exhausted, but whatever, I'm a team player. So we just did our jobs and kept it moving. The entire day was busy with little to no break time. So if you ever worked pizza on a Super Bowl Sunday, you can imagine the crap show I'm describing. Phones ringing off the hook, ovens packed to the brim, carry out lobby full. My coworkers and I were like a well-oiled machine. We knew how to work with each other very well. No mistakes, no late orders, busy as hell, but we got this. Then enters the regional manager, Jeff. Jeff and I knew each other since we were teens, as we had both started with the company around the same time. He has not worked in a busy store in years. His primary role is to check in at various stores and ensure that they had what they needed. But of course, he wanted to jump in and assist us. Shake my head. Jeff immediately begins dropping food on the floor, packing orders in wrong boxes, routing deliveries improperly, and just about anything else he could do wrong. It was annoying, but we could not say anything. Jeff would blame us rather than admit that he was screwing up. At some point, I decided I could take a few puffs from my cigarette at the back of the store. After all, I had now been here 12 hours with no break. A cigarette would take the same time as if I went to take a dump, so why not? I literally took 2 puffs and threw my cigarette out because I heard the phone ring and wanted to help. When I turned around, Jeff was staring at me like I just screwed his wife or something. Before I could say anything, he said, "Oh yeah? Get the F out of here, we don't need you." Mind you, this was 2 hours before the end of my shift. I was the only person here on time. 12 hours with no break and made no mistakes at all. On top of that, I was scheduled to open the store the next morning. I simply replied, "Sure Jeff, no worries." I went home and planned my revenge. When I came in the next morning, I put my store key on the manager desk with a handwritten note. "I am no longer needed here. I quit." I took a picture on my phone and sent it to my coworkers who I knew would still be sleeping. No one knew until a few hours after the store was supposed to be open, and they lost hundreds of dollars. I quickly found a better job with more pay and less responsibility. Today I make triple what I made them. Apparently though, he still brings me up years later claiming that my mummy must be taking care of me. And the next one is titled, "Trespass on my property?" Bad idea. My parents purchased 6 acres of farmland back in the early 70s. They had built a house at the front of the lot and had started to plan construction of a small barn further back when fall came. One day my mother comes running into the house yelling about a bunch of crazy people riding snowmobiles and carrying guns through the backyard, right up next to the house near where a toddler, me, was playing. Dad comes out and the hunters insist that they've always come this way and what's the big deal. Dad explains that this is no longer fallow farmland, and that they need to find a different route. They say, "No way, see you tomorrow," and drive off. This repeats for several days. My dad, who does not suffer fools lightly, proceeds to dig out a deep, narrow trench across a good part of the edge of the property with the backhoe. He then hauls every bit of the summer-ripened manure pile from his 4 dogs from the foot of the property to fill the trench. Dead leaves and a decent dusting of snow camouflage the hazard. The next morning, the snowmobilers come roaring over the property line and slam headfirst into the trench, leaving their snowmobiles vertical, well and truly stuck. Plus, of course, everyone and everything is covered in rotting dog poo. My dad stood by watching, coffee and his own trusty rifle in hand, while filthy, smelly snowmobiles were winched out of the trench by filthy, smelly snowmobilers. Unsurprisingly, the hunters did find a different way to their hunting grounds after that. And yeah, Ripe Stars, there's something about these revenge stories involving manure piles that make them seem very enticing to replicate, let's say it like that. Unfortunately, I'm not a farmer and I don't have farmland or anything, so I don't think I would partake in a revenge like that anytime soon. Either way, thank you very much for watching. Once again, sorry for my cold / my weird voice at the moment, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.